It's 3 in the morning on a mountain grade 100 miles from the nearest lit window, and you are the only thing awake for 50 miles in any direction. 40 feet of steel and glass under your 2 hands, 40 souls asleep behind you in the dark, and a road ahead that drops away into a fog you cannot see the bottom of. You don't touch the brake. A man who rides the brake down a grade like this cooks it down to nothing and arrives at the bottom with no way on God's earth to stop and 40 people who are never going to wake up. So you gear her down instead, low and growling, and you let the engine hold all that weight back the way a strong hand holds a frightened animal. Steady, patient, and you feel the whole coach lean into the curve and settle and come back to you. Behind your right shoulder, one little reading light is on. The seat directly behind the driver, the only passenger who can't sleep tonight, a kid with a taped-up cardboard suitcase on his lap, and a one-way ticket he's held so long the ink's gone soft. He's running from something. They are always running from something in that seat. You've got a thermos gone cold between the seats, a schedule that says you're due into a town at 4:52 that half this country is already forgotten is even out here in 300 more miles of black nothing before the sun comes up. Out past your headlights is an America that nobody photographs. The truck stops and the grain elevators, the towns the size of a gas station, the people with no car and no plane fare and nowhere to be but somewhere other than here. And you are the last scheduled thing in the whole country that still stops for them. You carry the soldiers home and the runaways out, the just released and the flat broke and the barely holding on, all night, on time, in the snow, and not one of them will ever once know your name. Some men build this country, some men leave it. You're the one who comes through in the dark to carry whoever's left. You are very, very good at this, and this is your whole life. Out here on the night run, you are a kind of king. A king of the one country nobody else wants at 3 in the morning. There isn't a mile of this route you can't drive blind. You know every grade and every switchback, which diner leaves a light on for the 2 o'clock dog and which one lies about it, where the fog pools in the low spots, where the black ice hides on the north face of a ridge in April, when everybody down in town thinks it's already spring. 400,000 miles and change, and you have never once put a mark on a single passenger. Not on ice, not in a whiteout, not the night the drunk came up the aisle with a bottle by the neck. The dispatchers know it, and they say your name into the phone when a run comes up that nobody sane will take. The all-night milk run that stops in every played-out town on the map. The mountain leg in a storm, because you bring the coach in, and you bring the people in. Every soul you started the night with, every single time. Out here, you matter. But it was not always your hand on the wheel. 15 years back, you were sitting in that seat behind the driver, the one with the little light burning over it right now. A young man with one bag and a ticket out, riding all night because a war had followed him home into the inside of his own skull, and the moving road was the only place the noise ever went quiet. So let me take you back. Let me show you how a kid who left his own dead-end town on a midnight bus with everything he owned in one hand became the best night man on the whole line, and what it cost him mile after mile to spend his life carrying other people home to towns he could never quite find his own way back to. You came up in a town too small to bother printing on a map, a grain elevator, a feed store, a church, and a 2-lane road that went 2 ways, and everybody you ever knew took one of those 2 ways out or never left at all. Your old man worked whatever there was to work and drank whatever was left over. And the whole place had the feel of something the country had already quietly finished with. The young ones gone off to the cities, the storefronts going dark one at a time down the main drag. The kind of silence that isn't peace at all. It's just absence with the lights left on. There was exactly one thing that ever came through that town from the wider world. One thing that proved to a boy there was a wider world to come through from. And it came at 11:40 at night. The bus, the dog. You'd see its headlights come up over the rise and swing into the gravel lot behind the drugstore, and the door would fold open with that long pneumatic sigh, and for 90 seconds, your whole nothing little town was wired to Denver and Chicago and everywhere at once. And then the door would close and she'd pull out and take somebody with her, and the red tail lights would shrink down the road to 2 points and wink out, and the quiet would come back down over the town like a lid on a jar. You swore, as a boy standing in that gravel watching those lights go, that one night it was going to be you on that bus and your taillights leaving. Then you turned 18 and the government sent you somewhere else entirely. Somewhere very loud. And it kept you a couple of years, and when it finally turned you loose, it did not send home the same boy it had taken. You couldn't sit still in a room anymore. You couldn't sleep in the country quiet. That was too much like waiting. You came home, and you lasted about a month before you understood, clear and cold, that if you stayed, you would become your father at that kitchen window, staring down a road that was finished with him. So you packed one bag, and you stood in the gravel lot behind the drugstore at 11:40 at night, and when the door sighed open, you got on the dog and you rode. You rode a good long while before you figured out where you were going, which is to say you didn't. Not for years. You just kept moving, because moving was the only thing that worked on whatever the war had left ticking in you. You took the jobs a man takes when he can't be still and can't stand a crowd. Night watchman, a stretch hauling freight, anything that let you be alone in the dark with one task in the front of your hands and no one at your back. And somewhere on one of those late buses, riding up front because that's where a man who watches the road sits, even when he isn't the one driving, you got to talking with the driver. An old hand, hands loose and easy on that big wheel, calm as still water at 2 a.m. And you told him the truth, that you couldn't sleep and couldn't sit and couldn't stand a room with too many people breathing in it. And he laughed, and not unkind, and he said, "Son, I've got just about the only job in America that pays a man good money to be exactly like that. And the math of it hit you cleaner than anything had hit you in years. A union card, steady pay, real pay. The kind with a pension waiting at the far end of it. The whole country unspooling past your window and never a boss standing at your shoulder from dark to dark. A job where the aloneness wasn't the sickness. The aloneness was the qualification, the very thing you happened to be good at. A job where being wide awake all night while the rest of the world slept was a service you performed, not an affliction you carried. Your whole life so far, every man in a necktie had told you that what the war left in you made you unfit for the ordinary run of things. Here was one old driver at 2 a.m. telling you it made you fit for this. So you said yes. You put in the application, and you waited. And the morning the letter came that said, "Report for training," you felt a thing you had not felt since before they ever drafted you. You felt like somewhere out there was a seat with your name on the back of it. The man who made you was named Earl. 30 years on the night runs, a face like a folded road map, and a voice worn all the way down to gravel. And he had trained enough green kids to know inside of a week which ones would last the winter and which ones wouldn't. He rode along with you at the start, just watching. watching how you carried the weight, how you took a grade, how you were with the people when they got scared or got mean. And then one night he grunted, which from Earl was a diploma with honors, and he started teaching you for real. He taught you the coach, how to feel 40 feet of bus like it was your own body in the dark, how to back her square into a loading bay on nothing but the mirrors, how to run a mountain in fog by the reflector posts in pure memory when you couldn't see past the front of the hood. And then the rules, Earl's rules, the ones that had kept him and every soul behind him alive for 30 years. Rule 1, and he'd say it slow so it stuck. You do not ride the brakes down a grade. You gear her down. You let the engine hold her back. You stay patient all the way to the bottom, because a man in a hurry cooks his brakes to smoke and kills a busload, and there is no schedule on this earth worth 40 lives. And rule 2, this one he only ever said the once, low, with 2 fingers tapping the seat back directly behind the driver's. This seat right here, that's the confessional. Sooner or later, the one who can't sleep gets up and comes and sits in it, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, they will tell you a thing they have never told one living soul. Because you're a stranger they will never lay eyes on again, and the dark makes it safe to say out loud. You don't preach at 'em, Earl told you, flat, both eyes on the road. You don't try and fix 'em. You are not their daddy, and you are not their priest. You keep her between the lines, and you get 'em where they're going. That is the whole of the job, kid. You carry people. However heavy they come, you carry 'em and you get 'em there. Your first solo run, you took 40 strangers over the pass in the spring snow, and you set every last one down safe at the far end, and you sat alone in the empty coach after with your hands not quite steady on your knees, and you understood, finally, that you had found the one thing you were put here to do, and you got good. Good the way Earl was good, and then a shade better, because you had nothing waiting at home, and nothing to do with the life, but pour it into learning the road. You learned the whole country by night, not the country off the postcards, the other one, the 2 in the morning one. You knew which truck stop had coffee worth killing the engine for, and which was just a cold bathroom and a busted machine, which town's depot was a warm drugstore with a clerk who'd lift a hand to you through the glass, and which was a padlocked door and a bench out in the wind. You learned to run the express, and you learned to run the milk run, the local, the one that stops at every wide place in the road, 40 stops between dusk and dawn. And God help you, you came to love the milk run the most, because the milk run went to exactly the people the express blew right past in the dark. You could back that coach into a black alleyway, blind on the mirrors, hold a schedule to the minute across 300 miles of nothing, read a drunk the second he stood up, and talk him back down into his seat with a low voice and a level look, and never once raise a hand. And you learned that seat behind you. Lord, the things that seat told you. The soldier riding home who could tell a stranger at 3 a.m. what he could never tell his own mother across a kitchen table. The girl with a split lip and 2 paper sacks for luggage, going anywhere at all that wasn't where she'd been. The old man just turned out after 11 years inside with a state voucher and a cardboard box, more scared of a world that had gone fast without him than he'd ever been of the one he left. The young mother carrying a baby across 4 states to a father you could tell, just from the way her voice shook, was not going to be standing at that station. You carried them all. You didn't fix a one of them. Earl was right, you never could. But you kept the light on over that seat, and you kept her on the road, and you got every last one of them where they were going. That was the thing you did that not one other soul in the whole country would do. You came through in the dark for the ones who had nowhere left to turn, and you got them there. For 15 years, you were the thread that stitched the forgotten corners of America onto all the rest of it. You were the best night man on the line, and everybody who dispatched a bus knew your name. And a man who is that good at carrying other people through the dark is standing right about then at the very top of a grade he cannot yet see the bottom of. But the road takes its cut. It always takes its cut, and Earl had told you exactly where. It takes it out of the daylight life, the one that goes on happening while you're either asleep or 3 states gone. First, it took your sleep, for good. You lived the whole thing backwards, wide awake and sharp at 3 in the morning and dead on your feet at noon, until daylight became a foreign country you only ever visited, squinting for a few hours between runs. Then it took the home. You'd married a good woman in that short window between the war and the wheel, and you kept right on meaning to be there, and the run kept right on calling. And you'd tell yourself the pay was for them, and it was. But a check folded into an envelope is not a father at the supper table, and you drove on past your own life for years the way you drove past 1,000 dark little towns, lit up for 1 second in your headlights and then gone behind you. Your kids grew up in the narrow spaces between your runs. Your wife learned that particular brand of lonesome. They've even got a name for out here, highway widow, married to a man whose truer marriage was to a road she was never once allowed to follow him down. And then there was the weight of that seat behind your shoulder. Because here is the thing nobody ever tells you about being the one who carries people. You can't set them back down. 40 strangers a night hand you the very worst thing that ever happened to them. And then they step off at their stop and they're gone into the dark forever. And you keep rolling and all of it stays right there on the bus with you. You started to feel like a ghost that only came fully real between terminals. A pair of steady hands and a low, calm voice. Solid on the night road and not quite solid anywhere else on the map. You'd sit in the driver's room at the far end of a run drinking coffee you couldn't taste. 40 people's confessions riding around loose inside you with no place on earth to set them. And you think about Earl, and you would finally understand why the old man's eyes always looked like they were listening to something a long, long way off. 2 things broke you, close together the way it always seems to come. The first came on a milk run in a February whiteout, and it came from that seat behind you. A kid, 16, maybe not even that, a taped-up cardboard suitcase on his knees and a one-way ticket held in both hands. And you knew that seat, and you knew that suitcase, because it was you, 15 years gone, riding out of a gravel lot with everything you owned in one hand. Somewhere past midnight, he started to talk, the way they do in that seat. And he told you what he was running from, and where he had it in his head he was running to. And it was a place and a person you knew for a cold, hard fact were not going to save that boy. And you broke Earl's rule. You didn't just carry him. You talked. You told him to get down at the next real town, to call the number on a little card you kept in the visor for exactly this, to not ride this thing all the way to the ending he had already painted for himself. And he looked back at you with that flat, bottomless 16-year-old certainty. And then he got off where he had always meant to get off, out into the snow with his one bag, and he lifted a hand to you, and the door sighed shut between you, and you pulled out and watched his shape shrink down small in the big mirror, the very same way you had once watched those red taillights shrink from a gravel lot. And you never found out. That's the part that stays with a man. You carried 1,000 of them, And you never once got to find out. And that was the job. And it was fine. It was fine for 15 years, right up until the night it was a boy who was you. And then it was not fine ever again. The second thing was 1983. The company you had given 15 years of your one life came to the table that fall and said the men would take a cut, a deep one, wages and pension both. Or the men could go ahead and walk. So the men walked. And you stood a picket line in the cold outside the same terminal. You had pulled that coach into 1,000 nights running. And you watched the company hand your bus to a kid they had trained up in a fortnight and send him out through your own gate to run your own route. And you watched buses roll out with the windows taped over against what furious men throw. And in more than one town, they called out the guard to stand in the diesel smoke. 7 weeks of it. And Earl, old Earl, off the road for years by then, his lungs gone bad from 30 winters of diesel and cold. Earl stood that line right beside you every single day he could still stand up. And he said to you the thing you have never once been able to put down, that he had handed those people 30 years of his life, and they had run the numbers on him, and they had found him too expensive to keep alive. The company you had let yourself believe was a family looked out at 40 years of men who had carried this whole country through the dark on their two hands. And it saw a number on a page that was too high, and it reached out with a pen, and it cut the number. You went back in the end. Most everyone did, back to worse than they'd left, because the only other thing waiting was your father's kitchen window. But something had gone out of it on that picket line that never once came back on. Here's the part nobody ever saw coming. And it wasn't the strike, and it wasn't a picket line, and it wasn't a man at all. It was a signature. A signature the year before, on a bill most people in this country never even heard the name of. They deregulated the buses. They cut the routes loose so that a company could keep the runs that turned a profit and drop the ones that didn't anytime it pleased and never once ask a soul's permission. And you have to understand what a thing like that meant out here on the Milk Run, in the towns the size of a single gas station. It meant the company could finally sit down and do the cold arithmetic it had wanted to do for 50 years. And the arithmetic said, plain as a column of figures, that those towns did not pay. So one at a time, the runs you loved the most got a line drawn through them. The little depots went first. The drugstore that sold the tickets. The diner that kept one light burning for the 2 o'clock dog. Because a stop that nobody profits from is just a cost with a roof over it. Then whole routes at a stroke. And the map of small-town America that the bus had quietly held, stitched together for half a century, came apart along the seams, town by town by town, each one cut loose in an office because it didn't pencil out. And not one man who signed off on it ever had to drive out there in the dark and say it to those people's faces. The interstate had already taken the middle-class folks with cars, the cheap airfares took the long profitable hauls, and what was left riding the dog were exactly, and only the people who had nothing else on earth, the old, the broke, the young with one bag and a soft ticket. And the market took one look at them and decided they were not worth the diesel it took to reach them. There was no villain out there you could picket. There never is. Just a bill and a spreadsheet and a country deciding, town by quiet town, in rooms you would never be allowed to stand in, that some places and some people simply were not worth the stop. The one thing you were ever for on this earth, carrying the people nobody else would carry, out to the places nobody else would go. The world had gone and quietly resolved that it no longer wished to pay for. So you got off the long runs. Not because you wanted to, God knows, but because there were fewer of them with every year that turned, and less in the envelope at the end of the week. And a body can only live backwards through the dark for so many winters before it starts to give out under a man. And so you did the only thing that made any sense at all for a man who knew nothing on this earth but how to carry people safe through the dark. You went home. You took the very smallest driving job there is. You drove a school bus in the county over from the town you'd once run away from at 11:40 at night. And if you ever want to know what it is to feel a whole life turn all the way back around on itself, you go and try that. 40 years you had carried strangers away into the night, out of their towns, off toward whatever it was they were running to. Now you carried the same 40 kids, 2 miles down the same 2-lane road every single morning, toward the one place they all had to be. And you knew every last one of them by name. The same 2 hands, the same mirrors, the same patience holding her back on the grade, the same low voice that could settle a whole busload gone to squabbling, the exact and perfect opposite of the job. Nobody in that seat behind you was running from a war or a man or 11 years inside. They were running from a spelling test. And you got them there, every one of them, every morning. And you watched them in that big mirror the very same way you'd once watched 1,000 strangers ride into the dark. Except these ones you got to watch grow up. You never told them where those hands had learned the road. You never told anybody. You just kept the light on and kept her between the lines and got the kids to school, and on the good mornings wheeling back into that same gravel country in the daylight for once in your life, you let yourself think that maybe a man who'd spent his whole life carrying other people home had finally, quietly, without a word to a soul, carried himself back to one too. Look at how they do it now. Go on, look. The great lines are gutted. Half the routes you used to run don't exist at all anymore, and the towns they cut loose back in '82 never got one thing back. They've even got a clean word for those places now. Transportation deserts, which is a tidy government way of saying you cannot get out without a car. So the old and the broke and the young with nothing are just left standing there, stranded, exactly the way your own town would have stranded you for good if the dog had never once come over that rise. The great depots, those cathedral halls with the high ceilings, where a whole town's comings and goings used to run through one warm lit room, they're parking lots now, or they're nothing, boarded over. You don't buy a ticket off a clerk who knows your face. You tap a piece of glass and it sends you to a curbside pole with a paper sign zip-tied to it, where a terminal used to stand. No bench, no light, no diner open at 2. Not one living person there at all. And the driver, if the run has even got one anymore, sits behind a screen that clocks his every second and every touch of the brake, and reports the whole of it back to a desk 1,000 miles off. So that even the aloneness, the one single thing that was ever truly yours out on that road, has got a camera pointed at it now. And that seat, the seat right behind the driver, the confessional, it's still there, but the little light over it stays dark because nobody sits up talking to the driver anymore. 40 faces lit cold blue by their telephones, buds jammed in their ears, each one sealed alone inside a private little box, all of them riding through the same dark together and not a word passing between them, and nobody up front awake to carry a single one of them. Just a schedule up in a cloud and a computer that keeps the thing between the lines and has never once in its life wondered where anybody on board was going or why. Nothing comes through in the night for those forgotten towns now. Nothing stops. You were the last warm-blooded thing that ever pulled in off the dark road for the places the map gave up on. And it turns out you were about the last one that ever will. So here's the question, friend, and only you can answer it. Was it worth it? All those hard miles in the dark? The sleep that never once came back right? The wife who married a road she was never let to follow you down? The kids who grew up whole in the gaps between your runs? The 40 strangers a night whose worst nights you carried and never got to set a single one of down? The boy with the cardboard suitcase you talked to against the rule and never found out about and never will? Would you climb up into that seat and do the whole of it over again, knowing you'd have to be both of them? The kid running out into the dark with one bag, and the old man at the wheel who carries the runners, the one who left and the one who stays awake all night so the leaving comes out safe. And here is the terrible thing. The thing you would never once say to a living soul. You would take that wheel again tonight. Right now, this minute. Because for 15 years, in a country that was quietly coming apart at every seam, in the dark, on time, in the snow, you were the one thing that still came through for the people that nobody else on earth would stop for. You carried them. However heavy they came to you, you carried them, and you got them there. And there is not one machine in all the bright wired world they built to replace you that has ever once stayed awake through a single hard night to carry a frightened stranger home. And every last one of them calls that progress. You knew better. You were there, at the wheel, all night, with the map they threw away.
The yellow lines are fading in the rearview mirror now. This ancient highway has quieted its roar. I've driven through the shadows of the only life I knew, and I won't be returning anymore. So farewell to the endless sky and dust upon the breeze, to every town that whispered in the night. The open road is folding like a map of memories, and fading out of sight. Just a single quiet guitar. Goodbye to the road.